Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. I'm hoping you guys are all having a fantastic day. So as you can tell by the title, we will be talking about this upcoming fall. And we do have a lot to cover. This is kind of my, official fall 2022 outlook and what I think will be happening in terms of the weather, in terms of the temperature, snowfall potential, as you can tell by the thumbnail. And yeah, I think I have a compelling piece of kind of evidence of what and what not to put together that I found pretty interesting by the time I completed it, and I wanted to share that with you. So let's first start off by looking at the Enso Outlook. So Enso is a area of water off your equatorial Pacific. Notice it's off the countries of Ecuador, Peru, and you can see that it's this region. So in terms of the actual anomalies, you can see that it's divided, or in terms of the actual water, it's divided into three or really four different regions. And whether or not this is above average or below average, the actual waters, is what kind of, makes an El Nino and a La Nina, La Nina. If these waters are cooler than average, right here, then it's a La Nina. If it's warmer, then it's an El Nino. And you may be looking at that and wondering, how the heck does that actually impact our weather? I mean, that is so far away from the United States, and it's just water. Well, it's actually has a big impact on not only the U.S. weather, but actually the world weather, specifically during the winter time. It doesn't have as large of an impact on fall as it does for winter, but it still does impact it. And based on historical years past, I could still prove it to you how it has a pretty resounding pattern in regards to how it affects the United States. So I want to show you that in just a second. But first, so again, there's the water. Right now we are dealing with the cooler side of the Enso, so a La Nina. And I just want to show that to you, that based off the latest kind of outlook they put out, notice we've been in a La Nina for the past 2 winters, and it looks as if predominantly for this upcoming winter and fall, you can see the La Nina will be maintaining itself as the predominant force of driving weather across the Enso region. And do note that there could be a weakening trend into the late winter months and eventually going into a neutral. So you can see this is our official kind of bar graph, if you will, of probability. Early on in the summer, if you recall, I made videos. This was still about even. They weren't really sure, but I did say that the La Nina is more likely. And you can see that they have been upping the probabilities there. There really isn't a good trend of warming waters. It's pretty much staying consistent right now. There is going to be again a warming trend, but that's you can see February, March, April, and then that's only a neutral, not necessarily even an El Nino. So basically, you can see this model of guidance. This kind of shows where the temperatures could be. Some are showing an El Nino by the time it's December. That's really just one model. And then the main statistical averages, the ones that are kind of more basically safer to look at, keep an La Nina till at least the middle part of winter, and then transitioning into a potential neutral. Historically, I've always liked this set of models. They're always a lot more accurate. There are less kind of extreme outliers. There are still a few, negative 1.5 right there. That's a very strong La Nina. I do think that the La Nina will stay around the current levels where it's at, and notice that again probably. If I were to assume, I would say around January or February, we could be exiting the La Nina into a weak or kind of a borderline neutral. So, how does this impact the weather? Well, basically, the Climate Prediction Center, you could go back and track back years of all the climatology. And so, 2020, 2019, I think this goes back all the way to 1950. And you could see how the different La Ninas and El Nino episodes kind of occurred. And you could look at how the weather, of those years panned out and compile all the years that are, for example, La Nina falls, and see whether or not they have something in common. Whether or not their early part of fall is always warm, the late part is cold, or if it's just all cold or warm. There usually is some sort of a pattern, and I did find a pattern with this. However, I didn't just want to use all La Nina falls, because that's just a bit too general. So what I looked for specifically when I was hunting down these years in this graph, which you can see again takes us back all the way to 1950. So a very, very, a very solid, database of information about this. What I looked at was the waning kind of La Ninas into a neutral. So, for example, take a look at 2016, right? I used that year as an analog for this year. And look, we start off with a La Nina, and then around midwinters, similar to like this year, supposedly. Again, I'm going off a big kind of assumption that graph we were looking at earlier and these models are correct, which again, they may not be, but That's the best assumption I can make at this point. Better to assume that than not. So, notice again, La Nina transitioned into a neutral. So I looked at that year and, saw what the impacts were, and then I added more years. So 2017, 2018 also was in La Nina. It continued a bit longer into April, but again, this year maybe, it may continue much longer as well, so we'll have to see. I use that year because you could see throughout the winter, the La Nina was mainly weakening, especially towards the later half, and eventually transitioned into a neutral. So I did that, found all those years that I could where the La Nina was weakening throughout the year and eventually transitioned to neutral into the spring, which is the most kind of comparable, I guess, years I could have found to this upcoming year's forecast. But then I also just did take all the La Nina falls, just to, I guess, show you what that looks like. Just a classic La Nina fall, not taking regard whether the La Nina was intensifying, strengthening, or whatnot. Just, the fall months, and because that's what we're interested in. This is the fall forecast. I will be making a winter forecast soon as well. Unfortunately, it's a bit cut off there. You can see that does say September though, SEMP. The S and the E is a bit cut off, but these are all the years I found that are just, again, the classic La Nina falls. I didn't take into account the weakening La Nina thing. I'll present you a group of pictures later on that I did select just those years, but you can see these are all years that just had La Nina fall. And this is what the month of September looked like for all those years combined. You can see that it was surprisingly cooler for a good portion of the northern United States. You can see Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota. Again, that made it look pretty aggressive, but because it's all these years combined, you can see it's really a marginal difference. It's only 0.7 degrees Celsius cooler, but that's still a pretty significant anomaly given that there are so many years in this database. Do note that the further south and east you got, the chances kind of were diminished. Now again, whether or not this will happen, it's tough to tell, but historically, based on a La Nina fall, the early part of fall was chilly and cool. Whether or not we'll see that, there are some signs in the long-range forecast. We are in mid-August at this point, and there are some signs that we could be looking at some pretty intense fall blasts. But again, whether or not this occurs this year, it's tough to tell. This is just kind of based on what historically happened. Now, this isn't necessarily meaning that the whole fall will be cold, because look what happens when I put this to October. You can see, it's a complete pattern flip. And I think that this is a pretty, I guess, likely scenario for this year, because all the recent years, 2020, 2021, or 2017 especially, the more recent years that I remember, the La Nina falls, and especially around October timeframe, were indeed very warm. So you may be thinking, okay, so how is this gonna, I guess, how does this make sense? September is cold, October is very warm. Basically, what I do think is that the early part of the fall is a bit of a mixed bag. It can be either or, but I think that towards the middle and I guess late early part of the fall, so November, things could warm up pretty quickly. And I'll show you. So again, October of all those years, you can see a pretty warm anomaly. It's cooler towards the north and west. And in November of all those years, you can still see it is still pretty warm. Not as warm as it was for October, though it's still anomalous in terms of the warm side. So now let's see what the whole fall looked like, because I showed you each individual month. Let's see what they all looked like together average, and it is cut off, but that is basically September through November of all of these years. Again, you can see that those impacts of the chill is especially predominant across Canada, the western United States. Again, in a short range, it's looking pretty warm for these areas, so whether or not this actually pans out, again, this is just a historical kind of average of what tends to happen during La Ninas. Doesn't mean, there's probably years in here that are completely flipped. But again, the fact that there is such a strong signal means that a majority of these years had a pattern that resembled this. Again, potentially meaning this year could be the same. And do note that, again, overall, the fall was rather warm, and especially for the eastern half of the United States, eastern, I guess, 2/3 even. And that's usually the case if you search up, or usually a La Nina is characterized with a warm fall across the United States. However, I was curious, again, as I mentioned, how quickly does it turn cold during the actual winter months? And look, this is December. Again, it's cut off, but these are all the dates, same years that I chose for December of that same year. So it went from a November being like this and an October being like this to the December being very cold. So why I do think that this fall could be actually surprisingly snowy, I'll make a separate video kind of describing that. But, you may be looking at this and being like, okay, so October will be warm, November will be warm, and I really do think this year will be the same. However, because of how quickly the forecast, or I guess the pattern, could change come December, or maybe even late November. These contrasting air masses of the cold and the warm being still pushed out, usually, and I remember like 2017, 2018, 2019, some of those years, we've had early snow for a good portion of the United States because of these, we have cold air really starting to settle itself up across southern Canada and northern United States. We still have this very, very warm air kind of to the south, and this fuels some pretty big storms. So despite what the temperatures show, you can see of being pretty, pretty warm. This doesn't look like a snowy fall, and again, I don't think there will be much snowstorms in October, obviously, but come November and December, when the snow usually occurs, and I guess what defines a snowy fall is usually, again, the later half of fall, not September, kind of when it actually matters, it turns cold. So I do think that this fall could be a very interesting one, and I do think it will be one to remember because of the early season heat potentially. I do think it could be pretty bad, followed by some pretty darn chilly air that could, just abruptly turn things into pretty much winter. So that is that. I also did want to show you the precipitation of those years, the rainfall. Notice towards the south and east it was drier, towards the north and west it was more active. Again, whether or not this holds true, we'll have to see. Hopefully it does, because you can see it brings some rain into the areas that kind of do need it. But again, this is more speculative. Precipitation is even more harder than temperatures to kind of our forecast for using previous years. So now I want to show you those years that I was talking about where that La Nina transitions into a neutral, right? So the La Nina is weakening throughout the fall and winter, and eventually by late winter transitions into a neutral, which is what we could be potentially looking at this year. So I kind of wanted to make it more specific for this year. You can see September, just like the other La Nina months, the classic La Nina, the September seems to be the chilliest month. Whether or not that will be the case this year, it remains to be seen. Even if it's not chilly overall this year, it may just end up being the least warm of all of the months. And again, as just like the other ones, October turns out to be a pretty warm month, especially for southern Canada. I am starting to see some signs that this may be coming true. But just earlier on, even in September, there are models that are showing pretty anomalous temperatures across southwestern Canada. Again, you can see the cool air, though, across the northwest right there hanging on, and across the southern United States. Again, that could be the case this year. We will have to wait and see. So that is October. November, again, you can see it's still warm, but not as warm as October, and you can start seeing some of this cooler air starting to die further and further south. And again, just like with the previous years, this is a whole, I guess, fall averaged out for the specific years to this year, or the more ones that are kind of, I guess I adjusted to be more specific to what we could be seeing this year. So you can see potentially not as warm as just a regular La Nina fall as compared to, a weakening La Nina fall. Again, though, you can see that this is kind of all over the place, and I would say there's not really much, data you can take away from this other than northwest potentially being chillier, maybe the south, and anywhere else is kind of a question mark, probably just too variable, honestly, to base this off of history. When you have an anomaly like that gives you a little bit of more confidence, but when it's something like that, overall fall you can see is a bit more of a mixed bag. And then I wanted to look at the December of those years as well, right, of the ones that had weakening La Nina. And just like the other ones, you can see the December turns very cold very quickly. So again, that could hold that theory that by, maybe even November, mid-November, we start seeing storms and snow. Again, that's still fall, and that could quickly, turn, I guess, the fall from a very hot one into a potentially snowy and chillier one. So that's definitely something interesting I picked up. I skipped over this earlier, but this is basically the surface precipitation rate for all those years. Again, similar to what I showed you last time, drier for the most part of the United States. That's what it shows. Maybe a bit more active towards the northwest, but again, it definitely seems a bit drier. We'll have to wait and see. This may or may not be true this year. So again, there's that December. Again, pretty interesting how it just goes from being warm like that in November to the December being just downright cold. So what does this all mean? Well, basically, what I do think, this is my temperature graph for this fall. It's not the best thing in the world, but bear with me here. So do note that I have a good portion of the central and northern United States here in this red. I do think this will be the hottest area this year. Honestly, this heat may be able to expand itself further into the south, but I was less confident, so I just put in just a bit of kind of lesser heat. I'm not as confident as in these areas here. There could be a little bit of chillier air across the northern United States. There are some signs, especially recently, that we've been seeing these cooler air masses. Any big storm that comes by could bring in a little dose of cool air. I don't think it'll be far reaching into the United States because of this heat, but it definitely could cool off a good portion of kind of especially southern Canada and the Great Lakes and New England. Again, I'm not showing much of Canada in this forecast because you can see the graphs that I have. They do show for Canada, but these maps don't, so I'll just, say it with word, what I think will be happening across Canada. I don't really have the provinces drawn in. Northwest, I do think will be chillier, especially towards the later part of fall when the La Nina really starts getting kind of its characteristics going and that cooler starts, budging itself to the south, especially again towards November and December, late November, maybe early December. And again, for, British Columbia and whatnot, Alberta even maybe, that's just probably also true. Some cooler air towards the later half, but early season heat, especially into September potentially. Here I have a little bit of cool air because of just the sheer amount of monsoons that are occurring this year. I do believe, cloud cover and rain will keep these areas cooler. And if not, the heat that does occur probably won't be too sustained, at record anomalies and whatnot. So I guess just kind of a mixed bag. But again, if the monsoons continue into fall, there could be just cooler weather because of that. So that is that. I want to show you kind of now, I guess, some of the text is a bit blurry. Just basically the highlights, what I think will mark, I guess, fall for these areas. Again, let me start off by kind of going to the northwest. I think there will be early heat. Some of that heat will be actually pretty intense. But late fall, mid to late fall, especially late fall, it could start getting stormy and cooler, potentially with just downright cold weather and a lot of storminess late fall into almost early winter. Southwest, I just did monsoon activity. I think that's going to be the biggest defining feature so far. It has been for much of the summer, and there's no signs that will be stopping. Central United States here, I have heat. Again, I think it's kind of, you may be thinking it's a bit weird to have this heat right next to the cooler air patch here or here across the central United States, but this doesn't necessarily mean that it will be cooler here predominantly the whole time. Again, as I said early on, I think much of the United States will be under a lot of heat, but later on, again, even including this area, quite a bit of heat, but there could be a bit more cool blast mixed in here, and not necessarily as of a defining feature as across the northwest with the later part of the fall being cool. I think the heat could continue across these areas into late fall, or it could be more more dominated by the cool blast. That's kind of impossible to really tell. And again, some of this heat that does mix in here will be pretty strong and pretty anomalous. And anywhere in that gray, you can see I just have areas that are, it's kind of a mixed bag. Could be more impacted by the monsoons, maybe the heat, maybe the early season storms, maybe some of these cool blasts. And then a warmth here across the southeast. I just think these areas won't be terribly too warm. They won't be dealing with extreme heat like I think some of the central United States will be. But I do think that they still will be warm and most likely also slightly wetter than average. So that is what I think will be kind of the highlights for this year. And again, I want to go over the last part. Why I think that some of these areas have a good chance for snow here, or a snowier fall is, you may be looking at this and being like, best chance for snow right over the areas that have the heat. How does that make sense? Again, that heat I do think will be, into September, maybe not as September, but October definitely, as you saw the graphs really support that, November, and probably by mid-November, when the snow chances really start actually becoming a reality, I think that's when some of that La Nina cool air could, start diving into the northwestern part of the United States more and more. The heat still, but could be pushed down towards the south temporarily, and among those baroclinic zones between those two air masses, we could see some systems, not massive ones, but even just normal sized storms. They could squeeze through here and actually drop quite a bit of snow. And again, I do think there will be an abrupt change for these areas from a lot of heat to a good chance of snow. Whether or not that extends into the Great Lakes, Northeast, I do think the heat will be a bit stubborn, and I don't know how far down this cold air will go down. I guess late fall. Eventually, through winter it will, but yes, I do think that these areas actually have a higher than normal chance for snow late fall, despite them having heat earlier on in the year. So yeah, it's quite a bit of an interesting forecast. If you have any comments, let me know, because I don't know how much of you guys followed this along. I did, say a lot of things, and some of them probably not as cohesive as I would like, but essentially, if I were to recap this in, 1 to 2, I guess sentences, a few sentences. I do think that predominantly it will be a warm fall for a majority of the United States for early and mid part of the fall, I should say. But then as we start getting into late, mid, and especially early late fall and mid late fall and late fall, I do think that the chances for cold air coming down from the northwest are going to be increasing significantly. That heat could quickly actually get pushed down towards the south, and we could start seeing some nasty snow and cold, again, marking a stark difference from what the early and mid part of the fall could be. And again, a snowy fall, if it were to occur, the snow wouldn't really be falling in September, because no matter how cold you can get pretty much in September, you're not really likely to see a lot of it. But by November, if it's sustainable, you could see a lot of snow, and I guess that's what usually marks a snowy fall, snow in November, because yeah, again, late October for certain areas, yes. Maybe even early October across the mountains, but those aren't giant areas of population that I kind of want to talk about, and I want to cover as many people as I can. So that is that. And again, winter, I'll make an outlook on that, but I do think once fall starts getting cold, I think that cold could continue into winter for at least a bit. Obviously, I don't think it's going to necessarily be a brutal winter. There are no signs of that. And again, it doesn't seem like the fall will be brutal, but well, actually, fall maybe more so because of just extreme temperature swings, and I do think it could be one that's pretty memorable fall, because of how early season the heat is, mid-season heat, and then it kind of abruptly transitions into some cold air. And we've seen that typically more likely with La Nina years than any other year. So that is that. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll catch you all in the next episode. See ya. Bye.